My director of the institute will give the welcoming address.
Is it okay?
Yep, okay, please.
Okay. My special thanks goes to Professor Justin McDaniel for agreeing to give a talk. I'm particularly delighted that we are hosting a talk on Buddhism in Southeast Asia, a topic hard to be found in Korea. It is part of our endeavor to diversify the area studies and open up new opportunities for the young generation. I hope everyone enjoys the talk and gets to understand better of Southeast Asia's religious history. And please do not hesitate to share your thoughts and questions after the talk. Thank you very much again.
Okay, so thanks again for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about Pali and Thai manuscripts and lectures, connections across the manuscript world. Mainly, we're going to talk about two types of manuscripts, mulberry paper manuscripts and palm leaf manuscripts, and stop me if I go too fast or if you have a question. It's hard, I can't see the chat screen from this, but I will go back to it. Just signal me if you have a question. So first I want to talk about material, so what manuscripts are made of, and I'll talk about mulberry paper manuscripts first and then palm leaf. So this is samukoi, it's often called, or mulberry paper manuscripts. It's made out of the bark of the inside bark of the tree, of a particular type of mulberry tree, not the mulberry trees that are associated with silk making, but another type. And that bark comes off in strips, and it's bound and soaked in this type of perfumed water, or kind of this water that has different binding agents in it, and different makers of the paper have different kind of recipes for it. I've seen this made in many areas. It's made Shan states and Kachin area, Assam, Bhutan, parts of Nepal certainly, and India, and then in Thailand, and Laos, and Burma. And so made in this region, made in parts of Yunnan and southern China as well. And so you soak this bark, and then you it gets very, very soft, and then you put it into a type of paste, and almost like a pancake paste, and then you move bamboo racks through it, and it collects on the racks, and then you dry it. So you dry it like on here, and so it makes a really nice thick paper, stiff at first, but it can get flexible over time. And that paper is really good for absorbing paint in different types of inks and different types of color. It's much better than palm leaf for painting and doing kind of extensive design on. These mulberry paper manuscripts generally have lots of different uses, content. We have Damra manuscripts are type of manuals, usually for about to describe animals, for astrological or reasons or prognostication. They can be ritual manuscripts, they could be protective manuscripts. Sometimes they are based on the Abhidhamma, especially the Abhidhamma Jet Gumpi, or a chanting version of the Matika of the Abhidhamma used at funerals. Other times, and probably most often, we have Pratmalai. The story of Pratmalai is used on mulberry manuscripts. But sometimes we have jatakas or depictions of heavens and hells and cosmological manuscripts. So lots of different stories, but definitely Abhidhamma and Pratmalai would be the two largest kind of uses of these in Thailand. Yep.
Can I make a short translation now?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So 안녕하세요. 오늘 강연을 할 수 있게 되어서 영광이라고 생각합니다. 저는 오늘 태국의 박종희 필사본과 폐역경에 관한 이야기를 조금 해보려고 합니다. 일단은 재료에 대한 먼저 이야기를 해보려고 하는데요. 처음에 보셨던 이제 나무 줄기지 사진이 있었잖아요. 그게 뽕나무로 만들어진 멀베리로 만들어진 닭종이들, 이제 그 껍질입니다. 나무 껍질입니다. 이 나무 껍질들을 보통 그냥 물에 적셔서 만드는, 그래서 찧어서 만드는 닭종이와는 달리 이 향료가 굉장히 많이 여러 가지의 향료가 들어간 물에 담궜다가 그 종이들을 나중에 아까 보시면은 대나무 사이에 같은 이런 물 짜는 기계를 통해서 그것을 통해서 나온 이제 그걸 잘 걸러가지고 그걸 말려서 이제 그걸로 종이를 만드는데요. 보통 이러한 종이들은 이제 그 미얀마하고 중국 사이에 있는 샨이라는 지역하고요, 부탄, 네팔, 인도, 라오스, 미얀마 그리고 유난성까지 해서도 많이 만들어집니다. 이것이 부드러워지면은 굉장히 팬케이크 가루처럼 반죽처럼 되는데 이걸 잘 걸러야만이 좋은 종이가 나올 수 있고요. 이 종이는 그래서 물감이나 다른 이제 물품들을 이제 재료들을 잘 흡수하게 됩니다. 이 재료, 이 멀베리 페이퍼, 이 닭종이로 만들어진 이제 것들이 쓰여지는 이제 어떠한 데 쓰이냐면은 이제 탐라 매뉴얼, 그러니까 이제 동물 관련이나 점성학 관련된 글들이나 이제 아비다르마, 이제 불교 3장의 논장이라고 하죠. 논장 같은 것들이 들어가거나 아니면 이제 프라말라이에 관한 이야기들이고요. 아니면 이제 자타카라고 불리는 본생담, 아니면은 이제 코스몰로지컬, 이제 불교의 천문학 같은 것이 있잖아요. 그런 것들의 내용들이 그런 것들을 쓰이는데 가장 많이 쓰입니다. Done.
Thank you. So here we can see mulberry manuscripts wrapped, and I'm going to show lots more examples later of the content of these manuscripts in the painting. But before we do that, I want to move on to palm leaf manuscripts and different uses for them. So here we have palm leaf, and this is a workshop to make new palm leaf in Laos, the country of Laos. But also this is exactly how they're made in Thailand as well. And here we have palm that is stripped from trees, from the leaves. And then it is, again, it is soaked in water, it is bound, it's made kind of flexible. Then it's cut into shape, and then it is dried, and then it is shellacked, or a kind of coating is put over it that is made from a certain type of tree. It's a hardwood tree, so it's a sap from a very large hardwood tree in the region, and then it is cut, it is etched. So there's no ink on a palm leaf manuscript. It's carved manuscript. It's etched with a small razor blade, and then ash is put on top of the manuscript. Ash gets into the grooves, and that's how you can see the writing of it.
지금 그리고 두 번째 재료인 이제 폐역경, 그러니까 야자수입이죠. 야자수입으로 만든 이제 그 필사본을 보고 계시는데요. 지금 보시는 사진을 보시면 이제 라오스에서 이제 혹은 태국에서 이제 야자수입을 그거를 이제 물을 많이 적셔가지고 부드러워지면은 그것을 이제 여러 번 부드럽히고 이제 적시고 말리고 하는 과정들을 통해서 부드러워지면은 이제 그 종이를 길게 이렇게 쭉 잘라 가지고요. 그 위에 이제 코팅을 한 다음에 이제 그 위에다가 이제 잉크로 글을 쓰는 것이 아니라 조각칼로 글을 새겨서 그 위에 조그마한 이제 다른 이제 색이 있는 먼지가 이제 같은 걸 뿌려서 그 글자가 잘 보이도록 하는 과정을 지금 보고 계십니다.
Right, and so you can see further the etching here, and then you can see the covering of the ash, and then a second covering to fix the ash in place. And that's the final product. So that's a new manuscript, but they would look very similar to a manuscript 300 years old, actually. They wear very well, they last a long time. Palm leaf is incredibly durable and an excellent vehicle for writing, mainly because it can exist in a humid climate for 400 or 500 years, at least if it's kept well. And in a drier climate, much, much longer. And palm and mulberry paper absorb moisture at kind of regular rates. And so that they can remain viable, readable texts for a long time, where wood pulp paper, acid-free paper nowadays would last a long time, but wood pulp paper would certainly not last this long, or rice paper generally wouldn't last this long. So it takes a long time to prepare them, but they do last a long time.
여기 보시면은 이제 애칭을 하는 과정을 다시 보셨고요. 그리고 마지막 프로덕트를 보셨는데요. 마지막에 이렇게 종이 이제 팜 야자수 폐엽경이 만들어지신 걸 보시면은 그 위에 이제 검은색 이제 가루를 뿌리죠. 그렇게 해가지고 이제 그 글씨가 보이게 하는데 이러한 방식이 3,000년 이상이 계속 지속된 방식이었고요. 왜냐하면은 이제 그냥 이제 펄프로 만든 종이보다는 이런 그러니까 굉장히 시간이 많이 걸리지만 야자수를 여러 번 말리고 적시고 하는 과정에서 이 야자수가 습한 기후를 이겨낼 수 있는 내구성을 갖게 됩니다. 물론 건조한 기후에서는 더더욱 오래 버틸 수가 있겠죠. 그래서 첫 5년만 잘 지킬 수만 있다면은 이 야자수로 만든 폐엽경은 더 몇천 년까지도 갈 수 있습니다.
Thank you. But there are problems with palm leaf. It does last a long time. It's very clear to read. The ink doesn't rub off because there's no ink. But there are issues with it, and I'll talk about it in a second. The content of palm leaf manuscripts is much wider generally than mulberry paper manuscripts. We have historical chronicles. We have types of glosses known as nisayas and wohant and namasaps. We have medical texts, praise texts called anisong, orasat, again, astrological texts, protective texts like paritas, grammatical texts, and then whole Pali text, and then vernacular stories. Having a text that is completely Pali or a text that's a Buddhist text that has no Pali in it is rare. They're almost always mixed languages. Another problem, though, with all of these texts is that when you bind a palm leaf manuscript, since they're not a leporello or accordion manuscript like mulberry paper, they're loose leaves, and so the leaves can get lost. And you can bind one text, say a grammatical text, an astrological text, and a medical text, all in one manuscript, and within the same two pieces of wood or cover. And so if you only read the first leaf or the last leaf to get the colophon or the title, you might miss that there's 3 or 4 different manuscripts within within one text. And so oftentimes these manuscripts in the past have been miscatalogued. And so we don't know the full content. So they really have to be recatalogued in full in the region, which there's been a process of doing.
이러한 폐역경이 물론 아까 말씀드린 대로 잉크가 증발하지 않고 그리고 이제 흙을 뿌렸기 때문에 이제 잘 읽을 수 있고 오래 가지만 그럼에도 불구하고 이 단점을 찾아본다면은 이것이 아직 계속되고 있지만 이게 나무 이제 이파리들이 모여 있기 때문에 중간에 하나가 없어지면 내용이 이어지지 않고요. 그리고 그렇게 그러니까 커버를 잃어버리거나 끝에 거를 잃어버리면은 이제 뭐 문장이 아예 연결이 안 되는 경우가 많습니다. 닭종이로 만들었던 그런 것들보다는 조금 더 이제 그 연결성에 문제가 많이 생기고요. 그리고 한 가지 또 특징점은 이렇게 폐역경은 지역 방언, 토속어를 많이 쓰기 때문에 이제 완전하게 다 읽혀지지 않을 수도 있겠다라는 그런 문제점도 있습니다. 이러한 이제 폐역경에 들어가는 내용에는 뭐 실록 내용도 있고요, 소설 내용, 그리고 의료 관련 내용, 그리고 뭐 이제 우리가 별자리 점 같은 거 그런 거 보는 점, 그리고 뭐 보호의식, 문법, 그리고 뭐 과거 관련들이 내용이 들어갑니다.
We have these manuscripts that can be miscatalogued. They can be, the covers can be lost. The first and last leaves can be lost. Mice and other insects, mice and rodents and insects like to eat them. They're very sweet. So we get a lot of damaged leaves. And so even though the paper is very, or the palm leaf is very reliable and long lasting, can be damaged by animals and insects. Also, another problem is that the titles and the colophons, well, not the colophons as much, but certainly the titles and the first leaves of the manuscripts are often in the Pali language. And so a lot of people might assume if they open up when they're reading that it's a Pali manuscript, but then it gets vernacular further on you go. And so it's hard to identify these manuscripts unless you're very patient. It's not a problem, but it's an active tradition. And so new palm leaf is still being made, new manuscripts are being made. Now we have kind of like a cardboard paper manuscript that looks like palm leaf that is, you can actually type on, print on a computer printer. But palm leaf presents a problem to the researcher for all of these reasons. And also sometimes they're not numbered. So usually the numbering system for palm leaf is through a series of letters, alphabetical letters in Thai or Northern Thai or Lao. But sometimes not. Sometimes these aren't, there's no numbering of these pages. So it's hard to keep them together. And we have just, it's rare to come across a perfectly intact 200-year-old manuscript. There certainly can be damaged or scattered or miscatalogued.
아까 말씀드린 대로 가장 큰 문제는 이제 커버하고 마지막 출판 정보가 팔리어로 쓰여 있지만 안에는 토속어로 쓰여 있어서 사람들이 오해하기가 쉽다. 그래서 카탈로깅이 잘 안 되고요. 그리고 이제 페이지 번호가 없어서 잃어버리는 경우, 그리고 쥐나 벌레가 먹거나 아니면 좀이 생기는 경우도 계속 있습니다.
Mulberry paper is not without its problems too. Usually you won't find a mulberry paper manuscript bound with other texts because these are made to be leporello or accordion or concertina texts, they're called. So they operate like an accordion. So they're generally intact texts. Sometimes we have paintings removed by collectors because they want to sell the paintings. Sometimes you can have separation and damage and then kind of re-gluing or re-taping sometimes of these manuscripts and insertion of other things. Sometimes you can have a manuscript that had blank pages at the end that are filled in by new painters, whether it be students practicing writing or painters practicing, or dealers wanting to make more money off of collectors and adding things over time. So we often have these texts that are hard to date because the first half might be from one era, one painter and one writer, and then the second or end of it or cover of it could be by a different artist and a different writer in a different era. So I've had mulberry paper manuscripts, that the first part was composed in 1872, for example, but the last part was composed in 1960. So you can see a big range of dates. The tourist market and collector market affects these manuscripts, and so you have a lot of newer ones that are made to look old, put onto the market and sold. You also have, since these manuscripts are most often made for funerals and read at funerals or displayed at funerals and given as gifts to monasteries at funerals, you have a lot of manuscripts that, in a sense, are copies of one another. So you have the same story, the same ritual text with different paintings. So it's not a problem, but you can have the exact same, almost identical sometimes text, but the paintings will all be different. And so how do you catalog them? You have to catalog them not by just the textual content, but also by the paintings. And so cataloging these manuscripts have to be very descriptive, because a title alone and a date alone won't be adequate often. Another issue is that they're spread out over many different museum collections and private collections, and that they are rarely collected kind of systematically by different museums and collectors.
Yep. 일단은 이제 이 닭종이로 만든 필사본의 문제들은 이제 가장 첫 번째 문제가, 이 닭종이로 만드는 필사본들은 아코디언처럼 책을 묶어서 만들어서 이걸 절첩 형식이라고 한다고 합니다. 그래서 이제 중간중간 그 있는 사이의 종이들이 다 완전히 연결이 된 게 아니에요. 그냥 뭐 이면지도 들어가기도 하고, 그냥 이제 쓰다가 남은 이런 이제 다른 닭종인데 그림을 그렸던 것이 들어가기도 해서, 그래서 어떠한 경우에는 이제 표지는 1870년에 만들어진 건데, 이제 마지막 표지 글은 이제 그림이나 그런 것들은 이제 1960년대에 만들어진 것이 들어간다던가, 그런 식으로 해서 그러니까 하나의 책의 연관성이나 시대성을 갖고 있는 것이 아니라 여러 가지 종이들을 이렇게 많이 끼워서 이제 이게 걷는 것들을 만들어서 이제 그것이 이제 가장 카탈로그 하는데 가장 문제가 된다고 합니다. 이러한 또 이제 그 닭종이 형식의 필사본들이 많이 있는 곳이 관광객들이 많이 모이는 그런 마켓 같은 곳에 많이 있는데, 여기서는 이제 관광객들한테 팔려고 이제 일부러 새로 만든 것도 오래 만든 것처럼 보이게 하기 위해서 오래전에 만들어진 것과 새로 만들어진 것들을 섞어버리는 그런, 아니면 페이크를 만들어버리는 것들인 경우가 많이 있기도 하고요. 그리고 이제 장례식 사업에서도 많이 쓰는데, 거기서 뭐 논장이 들어간다라거나, 이제 뭐 이제 프라말라이 아까 계속 말씀하셨는데, 이제 말라이 스님에 관한 이야기, 사후 하늘과 지옥 여행을 기록한 이야기인데요. 이러한 이야기들이 들어가거나, 자타카 아까 말씀드렸던 그 이야기들이 본생담 이야기들이 들어가는데, 이런 것들을 장례식 사업에서도 아까 말씀드렸다시피 관광객들한테 많이 팔리게 하기 위해서 이렇게 이제 좀 약간 페이크들이 많이 만들어진다고 하고요. 그리고 이제 박물관이나 사립 컬렉션에도 많이 붙어져 있기 때문에 사실 어떤 것이 진품인지 본품인지 그리고 가품인지를 알기가 굉장히 힘들다고 합니다. 하나 자체도 이제 인간성이 없고요.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Now I'm just going to look at a few collections, and then we'll look at a few individual examples of these manuscripts. Some of the big collections are in Copenhagen, Otani University, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, Oxford, the British Library, Harvard, my own university, the University of Pennsylvania, has quite a large collection, and others. But oftentimes, libraries will just have maybe one example, like Yale has one example, and Princeton has, if I remember correctly, two. And so you occasionally get one showing up, like the New York Public Library has four in one section of the library and has 3 or 4 in another section of the library. Palm leaf manuscripts are generally much larger collections, and there's just more palm leaf manuscripts, period. And so we find them spread out, but those are the big libraries, and other collections are being discovered all the time. This, for example, is in the New York Public Library. This picture, you can see a very long cosmological dry poem manuscript. So these manuscripts can be over 30 feet long sometimes, so quite 10 meters long. And so when stretched out, so they present a problem sometimes for reading in spaces and with collectors and librarians that don't know how to handle them and use them. But generally they're kept well, I find. And there's lots of collections that we need more study of. I've done a study of the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin over the past 10 years and cataloged that. Henry Ginsberg had started that work before me, and then I finished it. The Oriental Institute in Naples, Claudia Cucuzza has studied 4 major manuscripts there. I'm cataloging at University of Pennsylvania. I've worked on the Walters Art Museum, the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Free Library of Philadelphia has a couple nice manuscripts. Nagoya University, and in connection with the Nitaiji, the Thai-Japanese Friendship Temple, has manuscripts there, so etc. So lots of places to explore. I'll leave it there.
어디에서 찾아볼 수 있느냐면은요, 이제 아까 보셨지만은, 그래서 뭐 코펜하겐 오텐 대학, 그리고 페리 옥스퍼드, 그리고 영국에 있는 도서관, 하버드 예일 대학 등, 그리고 펜실베니아 대학 뉴욕 국립도서관에는 또 굉장히 많이 찾아볼 수 있는데, 이것이 다 카탈로그가 되지 않았다는 점이 중요합니다. 아직 연구가 안 되었다는 점이죠. 그리고 닥정이보다는 폐역경이 훨씬 더 많다고 합니다. 그리고 여전히 또 카탈로그가 안 된 필사본들이 뭐 프린스턴 대학이나 나고야, 그리고 필라델피아 자유도서관, 볼티모어 박물관, 바티칸 아카이브, 그리고 펜스테이트 대학, 더블린 체스트 베티, 더블린에 있는 것이고요. 뉴욕 국립대학, 이탈리아에 있는 동양학원, 사립 컬렉션 등에 있습니다.
Right. So here is me showing manuscripts mostly from Burma to students, and one student right next to me is from Seoul, South Korea. That's J.Y. Lee, my great student. But students from all over the world study these manuscripts. And I want to give you an example of how hard it is to study these manuscripts when we go into old collections. So this is a catalog entry to a manuscript. So the cataloger in 1929 didn't know if it was Buddhist, didn't know what scripts allow script. It might be Pali or Thai, which can happen. It can be a manuscript that has, lacquered covers and a cord, has different wraps, and these are all from different eras. And so that we don't get a lot of information from these catalogs, and we have to kind of go back in and redo it, which is fun work actually. But it's hard to assess actually what we have. And the difficulty is because that these texts, mulberry texts and palm leaf texts, can come in multiple languages and scripts, and that they are added to over time, that they are changed over time. They are living manuscripts in a sense, that they're not just frozen. We can have manuscripts in Khmer script, which is like modern Khmer or Cambodian, but with different changes in it. When it's composed in Thailand, in modern Thai, in the Tam script or the Duatam that is used in northern Thailand, or Lanna script. We have Shan script, Dai Lu, Dai Kun, Lao, and various Lao scripts. So you have in a home and so on. You have many types of script that can be all found in Thailand. you can have this numbering system that is used in alphabetical system used locally in different areas, and different writers use slightly different ways of marking texts. But you also can have European numbering in some of these manuscripts, which can make it help you date it sometimes. You have lots of corrections in manuscripts, sometimes with ink, sometimes with even whiteout, sometimes in pencil. So you have paintings that are painted over scripts. So sometimes when there's a mistake in the script, they'll use a painting to cover it up. We find this in European manuscripts as well, use of illumination to cover up textual mistakes. But also sometimes later painters couldn't read the script, and so they would just paint right over it. And so sometimes we have text that is lost under paintings. We have whole written text that are the entire page is covered up in a painting sometimes. So the manuscripts change over time. Another problem is that painters and scribes, so writers and painters, didn't work together often or meet together. And so that you would have a text where the writer would leave space for paintings, or painters that would leave space for writing, and they wouldn't communicate very well. And a painter would need more space, or a writer would need more space. So these workshops or scriptorium weren't always kind of a well-oiled machine or an assembly line of making text. We have a lot of times that there's no colophon at all in a manuscript. Sometimes colophons are added later in different scripts. That's very often. And so you don't, sometimes a colophon can be 40 or 50 years later than the actual manuscript, and that the person who wrote the colophon couldn't read the text, so they were guessing at what the text was. In the colophons themselves, we sometimes have the name of the patron, sometimes the name of the person who actually wrote it, sometimes the name of the teacher of the person that wrote it, because they want to honor their teacher. So it's hard to identify, or sometimes the abbot of the temple, so it's hard to identify who wrote it at different times. And then another issue that is pretty unique to Thai manuscripts is that the illumination or the painting and the text often don't go together. So you'll have a text, say, about Prat Malai, but the paintings will be from the Jatakas or the life of the Buddha, or different meditation scenes, or different local daily life scenes. And so it's hard to read the manuscript using the paintings and vice versa.
이러한 이제 필사본들의 문제점은 아까 계속 말씀드렸다시피 일단은 이제 언어의 문제점이 있습니다. 아시다시피 동남아에는 여러 가지 언어가 존재하는데요. 이런 언어들이 제대로 이렇게 많이 쓰이는 이제 언어들이 이제 현대 캄보디아인 이제 콤이라고 부르는 언어, 그리고 뭐 태국어로도 쓰이기도 하는데, 문제는 한 매뉴스크립트 안에, 한 필사본 안에 콤, 타이, 그리고 유럽 숫자가 다 같이 들어간다는 점입니다. 그 말은 곧 이제 중간중간 추가가 되거나 아니면 수정이 되는 것이 많았다는 것이죠. 하다못해 어떨 때는 뭐 연필 자국이나 이제 수정액 같은 것도 발견이 된다고 합니다. 그리고 이제 그것이 오래되면서 이제 글이 안 보이는 장에다가 갑자기 이제 뜬금없이 그림들이 들어가 있는데요. 그런 그림들이 이제 마치 작가와 그 그림을 그린 사람 화가가 같이 협력을 해서 한 것이 아니기 때문에 서로 이제 다른 방향으로 간다는 것이죠. 그리고 이제 정말 중요한 것 중에 하나가 마지막에 이제 출판 정보가 들어가 있는 페이지가 항상 이제 없어지거나 아니면은 나중에 추가된 경우가 많다는 것입니다. 그러한 이유 중에 하나는 재료가 충분하지 않아서 책이 한 번에 만들어지는 것이 아니라 이제 시간에 거쳐 가지고 처음에 이제 표지가 들어가고 내용이 들어가고 점점 붙어지면서 이제 관계가 없는 내용들이 계속 들어가게 된다는 거죠. 그것 때문에 나중에 이제 누가 필자인지, 누가 이 필사본의 이제 후원자인지 그리고 누가 스승인지 그런 것들에 관한 정체가 불분명해집니다. 이러한 것 때문에 뭐 이미지화하고 내용이 다른 이야기를 하고 있는 경우가 너무 많죠. 뭐 이제 이미지는 자타카 이제 본생담의 내용인데 텍스트는 이제 아까 프라말라이가 된다라든지 하는 이렇게 불일치성이 굉장히 많은 문제로 지적되고 있습니다. 그래서 필사본을 연구하기가 어렵고요.
Now I want to move on to talk about how these manuscripts are held and kept in libraries. So these vernacular texts, bilingual texts, Pali manuscripts, that they're often used for teaching. Sometimes they're just stored. I've had manuscripts that haven't been touched in 200 years or more, and haven't been opened, you can tell. Some manuscripts were given as gifts and ceremonies and never actually read, which is quite common. But a lot of manuscripts are used for everyday teaching or display. Many monks and nuns and lay people can't read some of the old scripts and certainly can't read Calm script. And so that's quite rare to have people reading Calm script manuscripts well. But then also old Tom manuscripts and Lana manuscripts and Tai Lu manuscripts. A lot of people have lost the ability to read these texts. But they are honored as sacred objects, and they are seen as a important heritage of local peoples. And we have different libraries where they're kept. For example, in this picture, you can see on the right-hand side, you can see a stupa where ashes and bones are kept of deceased members of the community. And right next to it, a small library in blue. These libraries are often built on stilts, and they have a small room with shelves, and where oftentimes 9 shelves for the 9 anga, or the 9 sections of the Tripitaka. But the manuscripts can be scattered throughout, and you can have different closets and holders for them. But oftentimes these small manuscript libraries are kept next to stupas or next to chetia, because you're keeping the heritage of the people, the teachers who have died, but also manuscripts from the past, and they're kept right next to each other. You can see these libraries are built on stilts to protect against insects and rodents and theft. And if you notice, there's no ladder up to these things. You have to bring your own ladder. And many times, one on the left-hand side, for example, in a small monastery in northern Thailand, no one could find the ladder. It hasn't been used in a long time, so I had to buy a ladder in one case to get up there. And other times I climbed up into them. Sometimes the keys are lost and they're locked and they can't find the keys, and so have to break the lock. But it's a fun type of research, and I certainly enjoy doing it. Other monasteries, they've collected the manuscripts out of these small libraries, and they have I've helped catalog a lot of these. So you catalog them and rebag them, and try to preserve them in the best way possible. This is, again, slow work. This is one of the largest collections in all of Thailand, Wat Lai Hin. And you can see it's a small library where you have a little veranda out front and then a small room, and that's the inside of the small room. And the manuscripts here have been cataloged and kept in glass cases in white cotton bags here. I'll stop there and I'll let you go.
그러면은 일단은 필사본이 어떻게 보존되고 있는가에 관한 이야기를 잠깐 해보도록 하겠습니다. 토속어나 또 아니면 이제 이중의 언어, 뭐 태국어, 라오스어나 뭐 이제 다른 언어들이 같이 이렇게 섞여서 쓰여 있는 그러한 필사본들은 이제 물론 교육용으로 쓰입니다. 이제 수업을 할 때 쓰이기도 하는데, 문제는 구하기가 어렵고 그렇기 때문에 연구하기가 어렵다는 것입니다. 그래서 지금 보여주신 사진들을 보면요, 이렇게 지방의 길 옆에 있는 아주 작은 사원이거나 이제 어떤 사람의 무덤, 스님의 무덤 같은 곳 그 옆에 쓰여 있는 이제 조그만한 이제 건물들에 이러한 것들이 보관이 되어 있는데요. 이런 곳에 보관이 되어 있는 거를 자신이 알고 찾아가야 한다는 거죠. 이제 그게 첫 번째 어려움이고, 아까 보셨지만은 이제 뭐 홍수나 이런 것들에 쓸려 내려가지 않기 위해서 지상가옥 같은 거에다가 2층에 이렇게 놓은 걸 볼 수 있는데, 자세히 보시면 그 지상가옥에 사다리가 없습니다. 그래서 자기가 사다리를 찾아야 한다고 하시면서, 이제 저스틴 맥데니얼 선생님은 자기가 사다리를 사서 거기를 직접 올라갔다고 하셨다고 하시네요. 근데 그렇게 사다리를 구해도 문제는 키가 없거나 이제 문 자체가 이제 부러져 있으면은 들어갈 수가 없고, 그 안에 있는 사본들을 구할 수가 없다라는 것이죠. 그래서 이러한 것들에 관한 이제 이야기들을 하시면서, 이제 아니면 조금 이제 나은 환경인, 아까 이제 what lie in, 그러니까 what은 태국어로 이제 절이란 뜻입니다. what lie in 같은 경우에는 그나마 조금 나아 보이는 환경이라고 할 수 있겠지만은, 여긴 뭐 유리장 안에 이렇게 있어 보이지만은, 그래도 이게 그냥 파일로 이렇게 그냥 다 있어서 이거를 카탈로깅이 다 된 것이 아니에요. 카탈로그로 만들어진 것이 아니기 때문에 자기가 말 그대로 처음부터 끝까지 카탈로그부터, 그리고 어떠한 언어로 쓰였는지, 그리고 출판 정보를 찾아내는 모든 연구를 한꺼번에 해야 되기 때문에 필사본 연구가 어렵습니다.
Manuscripts are often kept in what are called tu. This is a tu. The larger piece at the bottom is called a closet or tu, and then a heap, which is actually the same word for a casket, for a body, is on top. So you can find them in two different forms. And they're often very beautifully decorated and lacquered. Individual manuscripts for sermons or preaching are sometimes kept in boxes like this, with mother of pearl. And so you find these closets in different small libraries, like Wat Sung Men is a very famous library, probably the largest collection, most famous collection, Wat Sung Men. Even though it's quite small, you can say. You have manuscript libraries built in ponds on stilts, and so that you have to again protect against fire and insects and things like this. This is my son a long time ago, looking at a manuscript library there. You can see built in a pond. So again, to protect, and notice again, no ladder, so you have to bring and here another one in a pond, again to protect it. And notice no windows, so to protect against the sun and rain, things like this. You have collections that have been moved from one area to another, and this is in Laos. You can see small libraries here, and the community really honors these manuscripts and brings them together from their own private collections to be stored at monasteries as well. And this is ceremony too.
Yeah. Should I go?
And often, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. 아까 보시면은 첫 번째 사진에서 이제 보면은 이제 위에 있는 조그만한 상자를 힙이라고 하고요. 그리고 아래에 있는 좀 커다란 이제 장 같은 거를 이제 태국어로 뚜라고 합니다. 캐비넷이라고 하는데요. 장인데요. 이제 보통 이제 필사본은 힙이라는 그 위에 올라져 있는 상자에 있습니다. 그리고 아까 왓숭맨이라는 사진 외에도 다른 여러 가지 사진을 보셨지만은 이렇게 필사본을 보관하고 있는 사원들이 굉장히 작습니다. 그리고 방화의 위험이나 벌레에 좀 먹는 것들의 위험을 막기 위해서 일부러 뭐 연못 위에 지었다거나 이렇게 지상가옥처럼 이제 축대 위로 지어가지고 이제 사람들이 접근할 수 없게 만들었습니다. 창문이 없기도 하고요. 그리고 이제 작지만은 이러한 곳에 보관이 된 필사본들은 마을 주민들에게 있어서는 보물과도 같기 때문에 이제 그것들을 옮기거나 이제 그런 사원을 옮겨야 하는 경우에는 이제 마을 주민들이 모두가 모여서 같이 옮기는 이런 아주 중요한 행사라는 걸 알 수 있습니다.
I'm going to now, I know we're short on time, so I want to go over a few examples of individual manuscripts that two collections that I think you might find interesting. The Nitaiji, so the Nippon Thai monastery in Nagoya. This is a good example built in early 20th century as to honor a visit from the King of Thailand, Rama V, to Japan and the exchange of relics they have a very nice collection of manuscripts and work I've helped catalog and worked with them. We have lots of interesting manuscripts there, and lots of history between the two groups. I won't go into it, but oftentimes when manuscripts are given as gifts, they're accompanied by statues, they're accompanied by other paintings, and so it's not just the manuscripts in the collection, but it's a larger collection of things. And oftentimes manuscripts are ways of doing diplomacy and making friendships. And so we have Boy Scout troops in Thailand and Japan at that time coming together and creating. So manuscripts are exchanged for lots of different reasons. And you can see the cataloging work that I was doing there. These are palm leaf manuscripts, but they also have mulberry manuscripts as well. And it's interesting, here you have a Thai manuscript that was a Japanese box was made for. So you have the box and the manuscript can be different. And it's interesting, you'll find manuscripts from, say, Laos that are wrapped in Thai silk in different regions. And so you have to really see that these are living manuscripts and they're changed over time. So for example, here we have a palm leaf manuscript with a Japanese silk border placed around it. And this is to, I think the Japanese at the time didn't think the palm leaf was pretty enough, so putting a border around it, which I think is a nice addition. And another collection would be at the Walters Museum in Baltimore, a beautiful museum there. Hiram Woodward, the great scholar, has been working on these manuscripts. Here we have elephant manuscripts studying different types of elephants, but also we have a mixture of mythological elephants and actual elephants. And the descriptions of them. And a lot of times different museums will collect manuscripts like this that don't have a lot of content to describe, say, Buddhist teachings or rituals, but are examples of local culture. My own library at the University of Pennsylvania, you have lots and lots of different types of manuscripts there, where the paintings are quite beautiful. This is an example of an Abhidhamma funerary manuscript. So for funerary rituals, the Abhidhamma Jet Kumpi. But the paintings are not of the Abhidhamma at all. The paintings are different stories from Pratmalai. Here are the famous collecting of lotuses, a scene from the Pratmalai on one side. And on the other side, we have scenes from various levels of hell and torturing in hell. And so it's hard to, in a sense, to make sense of why all of these paintings and texts go together, but they do. We have paintings like this, which are, this is a very common scene to have 4 monks chanting at a funeral, and you can see a manuscript within a manuscript. So you can see how a manuscript is read by monks and chanted by monks within the manuscript itself. So you have almost a user's manual of how it was supposed to be used. But you can also see the monks' faces. They're kind of garish and comical. And this is difficult to figure out. Were these fake monks, as some people said, that would be used for chanting and giving entertaining stories of the Pratmalai? Or was it, in a sense, to poke fun at a funeral, to make light of a funeral, because these are always have 4 monks chanting at a funeral. But you can see the people in front of the monks chanting. They're not paying attention. They're playing games. They're relaxing as if they would be at home, children playing. And so this takes a very somber and very serious funeral scene and makes kind of light of it. And so we have lots of delightful paintings that can teach us a little bit about local history and local culture. And it's hard for scholars, but also a good challenge for scholars to figure out what these manuscripts were used for and what was the purpose of.
아까 이제 필사본 이제 종류들을 보여주셨는데요. 그 전에 제가 한 가지 놓친 부분인데 중요한 부분이라서 말씀을 먼저 드리겠습니다. 아까 이제 그 필사본이 어떻게 보존되고 있는가에 관한 이야기를 하시면서 이제 교육용으로 쓰이는 이제 뭐 토속어나 이중어로 쓰인 이제 필사본에 관한 이야기를 제가 번역을 해드렸는데 그 중에 마지막 줄이 하나가 이제 그 팔리어로 쓰인 필사본 같은 경우에는 워낙 대중화가 많이 되어 있기 때문에 교육에서 많이 쓰입니다. 그렇지만 이렇게 토속어나 지방어로 쓰인 이제 이중언어로 쓰인 필사본은 찾기가 어렵고 연구하기가 힘든데 어렵고요. 근데 이제 보여주신 예들을 보면은 사실 그 이제 결국은 이제 말씀하시고 싶은 점이 이제 일관성을 찾기가 참 힘들다라는 이야기를 하셨던 건데 이제 그 첫 번째 보여주셨던 게 니타이지 나고야 니폰타이 그러니까 나고야에 있는 니타이지인데 이제 그 니폰 타이 이제 그 절이라는 뜻이죠. 그래가지고 이제 여기 같은 경우에서 이제 컬렉션들을 보면은 회사들이 사거나 기부를 받거나 아니면은 외교 목적으로 이제 받았다거나 아니면은 친목을 다지는 경우에서 이제 뭐 보이스카우트들이 그런 것들을 모아왔다든지 그런 식으로 하는 컬렉션들이 이제 그 작품들이 있고요. 그리고 태국 필사본인데 박스는 일본 실크로 만들어진 이제 그런 것들도 보셨습니다. 그래서 이제 그것들이 이야기해 주는 것은 이제 전통적인 어떻게 필사본은 어떻게 보면 전통적인 것이지만 이 전통이 계속 이제 모던 이제 현대에도 계속 그렇게 뭔가 추가되고 수정이 되고 있다는 것이죠. 그리고 볼티모어 월트스 박물관에서 이제 코끼리 연구 관련 같은 경우 그림을 보셨을 때는 이제 이거는 그냥 단순히 이제 그 동물로서의 코끼리만의 진화를 보여주는 것이 아니라 신화적 동물로서의 이제 존재로서의 동물로 이제 코끼리를 보여주기도 한다고 합니다. 펜실베니아 대학에 있는 선생님의 컬렉션 같은 경우에는 아까 말씀드렸다시피 논장의 아비다르마에 관한 이야기를 하고 있지만 그림은 프라말라이 이제 상관없는 그림이라는 뜻이죠. 그리고 그 다음에 있는 그림이 더 재미있었는데요. 사명의 중이 이제 장례식에서 설법을 하고 있는데 필사본이 그림 안에 있었습니다. 여기에 있었는데 여기서 주목을 해야 될 점은 중의 얼굴들이 너무 웃기다는 거예요. 그냥 중의 얼굴이 심각하지 않고 그래서 이게 다 가짜 중이 아닌가라는 이제 의심을 하게 된다는 거죠. 그리고 그 앞에는 이제 아이들이 놀고 있는 그림이 있음으로써 이런 그림들을 통해서 보면은 과연 이제 어떻게 진중한 장례식에서 이렇게 풍자가 약간 코믹 같은 장면들이 연출이 될 수 있지라고 하면서 이게 풍자인가 민화인가라는 생각을 하게 되어서 그래서 어렵지만 그 의미를 찾아가는 것이 학자의 일이 아닌가라고 생각하신다고 하셨습니다.
Here's some other examples of kind of funny daily scenes. Here we have a monastery, but we have a couple clearly flirting with each other, and that they are kind of a romantic scene. We have a man who is napping in temple and falling asleep in the temple, but also something else might be happening in the temple. And so we have scenes of sexuality, we have scenes of gregariousness, scenes of party and drinking. And so it shows that monastic life, in a sense, wasn't always so serious. And we have celebrations, musical instruments, and so we have lots of different, and why were these scenes painted in a funerary manuscript often, or why do we have scenes like this? This, in a lot of times, local scholars have different theories themselves, and different scholars can argue over these, but it makes it, I think, a fun example. This is in Ireland, the Chester Beatty Library, some really beautiful manuscripts there. I gave a presentation in Ireland right before COVID on this, and a big display we put on there. These are scenes from Pratmalai, scenes from hell, Pratmalai visiting hell, scenes of the kind of end or the decline of the world with people fighting amongst themselves, scenes of heavenly realms as well. But within the Pratmalai manuscripts in Ireland and many other places, collections, you have paintings of monks meditating on corpses, which is called Subhakamatana. And so this was a relatively We don't know how widespread this practice was. It still goes on today. When I was a monk, I meditated on corpses as well. And so it is still practiced today. But we find that why would you include these types of paintings in a manuscript? That is not about that. Just manuscript is not about meditation. It's not about corpses, but you have paintings like that in it. So you can see other examples there.
이제 지금까지 보신 이제 앞에 민화 같은 경우에는 이제 죄송합니다. 민화가 아니라 필사본에 그려진 그림을 보시면은 이제 뭔가 계속 민화 같은 풍자 같은 그림들이 있죠. 보면 평신도들끼리 절에서 적절하지 않은 행동을 하는 것들을 보여줍니다. 뭐 서로 꼬시거나 낮잠을 잔다거나 아니면 연인들이 서로 연인 행동을 한다던가 하는데 이런 것들에 대해서 지역학자들의 해석은 굉장히 다양합니다. 그래서 이제 그런 것들을 보면서 우리가 이제 과연 이제 이러한 필사본에 그려져 있는 이미지들을 하나로 해석할 수 있는지에 관한 생각을 해봐야 하고요. 그리고 두 번째로 보여드렸던 것이 더블린 체스티 베이리 박물관에 있었던 프라말라에 관한 그림이었는데요. 이 프라말라의 이렇게 보통 지옥에서의 이제 여행씬을 보여주는 장면을 이제 보통 보면서 대부분 이제 해석이 달리하고 있는데 여기서 이제 아수파카 마타나 영상이라는 것에 관해서 이제 이야기를 하시면서 반드시 이렇게 모든 필사본에 들어가는 내용이 불교 관련 이제 부처님 관련해서의 이야기만이 아니라 지역의 이제 토속적인 내용들, 지역에 전해져 내려오는 이야기들이나 이제 교훈을 갖고 있는 이야기들이 들어가서 이제 섞여 있는 경우가 많다라는 이야기를 하고 계십니다.
I'm going to show you just a couple more examples, and then I will have to drive my daughter to her school. So, so this is a really interesting manuscript. It was cataloged as an agriculture and sports manuscript. I've never seen a description of a manuscript about agriculture and sports, and so I was very intrigued. But it has paintings from Chinese operas in Bangkok. It has paintings of these 4 badly behaving monks, they're often called, at a funerary scene, but then a kind of Chinese still life scene below it, and that we find showing up in manuscripts, especially this manuscript was made in the 1890s, but these scenes and paintings were actually popular in the 1820s and 30s. We have monks sweeping and chatting. We have scenes of Chinese opera plays outside in Thailand with crowds watching them. We have scenes of fighting and of men grabbing women and misbehaving and badly behaving and children running around. This is all in one manuscript. And we have scenes of men and women engaged in sexual intercourse, in boats with giant alligators about to eat them. We have men shooting and hunting birds. So why are all of these scenes in one manuscript? We have scenes of hell and people being boiled in cauldrons and climbing up spiked trees. We have scenes of worship and ritual, scenes of deities visiting and being honored by lay people. And then we have blank pages and unfinished drawings of monks reading manuscripts and copying manuscripts. And so we have lots and lots of different paintings in one manuscript, but the text has nothing to do with the paintings. And so the text does not describe the paintings at all. And so was this just something fun? Was an artist fooling around and entertaining themselves? Were they practicing different types of paintings because the paper was rare and hard to produce, so you would use it for practicing? And so these are some of the mysteries that we have from these manuscripts. And then the title of the manuscript has nothing to do with the content.
이제까지 계속 말씀드린 것처럼 처음에 이제 커버부터 그리고 중간 내용 그리고 그 안에 그림 그리고 마지막까지 일관성이 없다라는 것을 이 하나의 지금 보여드린 매뉴스크립트를 필사본으로 알 수 있는데요. 이 필사본의 제목이 농업과 운동에 관한 필사본입니다. 1890년대에 만들어졌는데요. 뭐 보시면은 중국 경극 그림이 있고요. 그리고 이제 나쁜 짓 하는 중들, 그러니까 이제 절에서 할 일을 안 하고 있는 중들의 그림, 그리고 중국 정모라 앞에서 이제 딴짓하고 있는 이제 중들, 그리고 중국 경극 장면이 갑자기 나오고요. 그리고 청중들은 딴짓하고 있는 그림들이 또 나오죠. 이런 것들을 보면은 과연 이제 이런 그림들이 왜 하나의 필사본 첩안에 다 있는가? 이것이 왜, 그러니까 관계가 없는데, 그리고 텍스트하고 이미지의 관계가 하나도 없는데 왜 하나로 모여져 있는가? 이것은 의도적인 것인가에 대한 질문을 해볼 수가 있죠.
And then the last example I thought would be an interesting example of a Thai Christian manuscript. And so not necessarily all Buddhist manuscripts, but we do have examples of mulberry paper. This is called black samurai, so it is stained black. It usually has white chalk or yellow cobalt writing on it. And this was a manuscript that was commissioned by a foreigner named Elizabeth Royce, who was married to a famous physician named Bradley in Bangkok in the 1820s. And they have, so she's commissioned this manuscript, and it's taken from the Gospel of Matthew, and has a Christian gospel text in it, but then also has other texts in it, describing Jesus as kind of a preacher who's a gift giver, and he brings a strange type of fruit, which of course grapes don't grow very well in Southeast Asia, and so grapes and wine are kind of that are very important to Christians, is not something that is hard to describe in Thailand at that time, how to describe them. And also use of Buddhist terms to describe Christian acts, use like things like compassion and punya to describe Christian teachings. And so you can see how difficult it was for local translators to make sense of Christian texts, and that having Elizabeth Royce trying to describe these things and work with them. So here we have a foreigner working with a local writer to do this. Also grammatical text made at this time to be translations of foreign texts and things like this. And so that when you open a manuscript, and this manuscript was simply described as local narratives, and it wasn't described as Christian at all, and it took me a while to figure out what this was. Not only do we have just last example is that manuscripts on paper, but we also have them written on metal scrolls, like you can see on this monk's back, in things called the krut, so protective texts and things like that are rolled on and kept on necklaces and kept on your body. And so texts don't just come in flat paper form, mulberry or palm, but they also can come in protective forms as well. And I'm doing a lot of studies on these right now. But I'll stop there. And then if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
마지막으로 이제 태국의 기독교 필사본은 저희가 불교에 관련된 것은 아니지만은 한번 보면은 재밌을 것 같아서 보여드리고 싶습니다. 그래서 이제 닭종이를 이제 만든 건데, 만들기는 닭종이인데 거기다가 이렇게 좀 칠을 해가지고 흰색 분필 같은 걸로 써가지고 블랙 초콜릿 페이퍼라고 불렀다고 하네요. 근데 이 특징은 이제 태국 기독교 필사본 같은 경우에는 출판 정보가 없고요. 그리고 이제 가장 특징적인 점이 이제 외국인 선교사가 이제 성경에 대해서 설명을 하면은 그 지역의 현지인들이 지역의 언어로 해석을 했다는 거죠. 그 지역의 언어로 해석한 것이 아니라 지역의 사람들이 이해한 방식으로 이제 그 성경의 가르침들을 해석했다는 것인데, 예를 들면 이제 탐분 같은 경우에는 이제 공덕을 쌓다, 이제 그러니까라는 말을 이제 기독교 언어로 이제 썼다는 거죠. 그래서 그런 것들이 이제 들어가고요. 그래서 이제 뭐 이런 것도 있고 반드시 이제 필사본은 이제 종이에만 존재하는 것이 아니라 이제 우리 이제 부적 같은 것으로도 존재하고요. 그리고 이제 몸에 이제 타투처럼 이렇게 문신으로도 존재하기도 합니다. 네, 그래서 이제까지 강연을 다 해주셨고 이제 질문을 받으신다고 하십니다.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Justin. Yeah, we are moving to the Q&A session, and just before moving to the Q&A session, I'd like to introduce to the Korean Korean audience in Korean for a short time. 아마 저스틴 선생님, 맥다니엘 선생님께서 이미 초두에 포스터를 보면은 안다고 이렇게 말씀하신 것처럼 뭐 라오스, 태국, 발리어, 산스크리트, 문학, 예술과 건축, 필사본, 연구 전문가 너무너무 연구 분야가 너무 기네요. 그래서 불교 연구, 물질문화 및 종교 연구 관련 논문 접평을 많이 내셨고 책도 뭐 많이 하셨는데 뭐 카인상도 받으시고 아주 세계적으로 아주 인정받은 연구자인 것 같습니다. 그래서 지금 현재는 그 펜실베니아 대학에 이제 계시고요. 에드문드 J. and Louise Kahn Endowed Professor of the Humanities로 계십니다. 그리고 저도 뭐 이 분야에 대해서 전혀 모르기 때문에 뭐 멀버리 페이퍼 하나서 뽕나무 가지고서도 그 종이를 만드나 이렇게 생각했어요. 여기 찾아보니까 당나무가 뽕나무과에 속하더라고요. 그래서 I just talking about the some explanation by you says that because I do not know this field, so I just share with the audience my feeling. With your talking. 네, 그래서 그래서 이제 해석하시는 현신의 선생님 이제 닥종이라고 하셨는데 멀버리 페이퍼 그렇게 말씀하셨고 또 그 중간에 그 선생님 설명하실 때 보니까 그 풀라 말라이라고 하는 이름이 나왔어요. 근데 뭐 저도 잘 몰라서 풀라 말라이 빨리 네이버를 컨닝하니까 그 공덕을 많이 쌓은 그런 그 스님이라고 그래요. 그래서 이 테라바다 부디즘에서 상당히 유명한 특히 태국에서 매우 유명한 그런 스님으로 있습니다. 혹시 제가 이해가 부족하면 선생님께서 이해하신 거를 좀 보완해 주시기 바라고요. 그러면 질문하신 것을 보시고 선생님께서 좀 뭐 해석, 번역이나 아니면은 좀 이렇게 소통하는데 도와주시기 바랍니다. 처음에 맥다니엘 선생님께서 필라델피아로 와라 이런 메시지를 여기다 또 넣어놓으셨어요. 그래서 그 매뉴스크립트를 보여주고 싶다고 이렇게 말씀하셨고 그다음에 지금 이 설명이 운산이라는 분이
네.
요거 좀
그냥 제가 번역을 계속
번역해 주시겠어요? 예. 두 분 거를 한꺼번에 조금 해주시죠. 심여영 예. 선생님,
일단은 이제 맥데니얼 선생님께서 직접 이제 이 필사본들을 직접 봐야만이 정말 재밌을 텐데 그래서 보시고 싶으신 분들을 필라델피아로 오시면은 자기가 직접 보여주신다고 하십니다. So you have two questions on the chat. Can you? Okay, so they are in Korean, so I'm going to translate them for you. The first question is that that was from Unsan. So what you were just talking is that everything is so in math. Basically, the whole manuscript is no order, there's no context. So how do you research them? First of all, like that's the first question. How do you research them or approach them? How do you know about the text and what's related? What's the stories about? Okay, the second question is from Shim Yeung. I totally enjoyed your lecture, and I am kind of curious about the language usage in the different types of papers. Like, so you talked about the model papers, and then you talked about the the palm leaves, right? And you said that they use more of the vernaculars. And do you think the difference in terms of the language usage in the different types of paper is having the different target audiences or the readership? Am I making a sense? Because like, you know, that you talked about the Pali, but there's also vernaculars, right? So why they are using, you know, different languages in the different manuscripts? So that's the two questions so far.
Great questions. I'll be quick. Yeah, it's fun research. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's hard. Sure, you have to know different scripts in different languages, and you have to go to lots of small collections in Thailand, Laos, Burma, different places in Asia and Europe and Australia. But that makes it fun. I like mysteries. I like puzzles, and so that each manuscript is its own puzzle. Each manuscript is its own challenge, and so it's you have to be patient, and you have to understand that you'll never get it done in your entire life, and that you have to lean on other scholars and friends, both nuns and monks and other linguists to help to figure out things. And I have lots of friends, and they're very helpful. And then I help other people, so we all get together. In terms of the language, it's a really good question. Yes, most manuscripts are vernacular. The vast majority of them are vernacular, not in Pali, but there's rarely any manuscripts that doesn't have some Pali in it. So it's usually mixed of Pali and vernacular languages. The use of up to 8 different scripts in the region, even more, 8 is a conservative number, actually, scripts in the region. And so you have many different languages and many different usage. And in one manuscript, you can have, I've counted one manuscript, 5 different scripts in one manuscript, and 3 different languages. And so that can be a challenge. Generally, mulberry paper manuscripts tend to be more in the vernacular. If they're manuals about cats and elephants, or manuscripts about cosmological heavens and hells, they tend to be in the vernacular. And then Prat Malay manuscripts tend to be in the vernacular, but they have sections, especially in the Abhidhamma, that are in Pali. Palm leaf manuscripts, you can occasionally get an entire Pali manuscript without any vernacular. That's quite rare. But you'll have usually Pali texts that are glossed and have commentary in vernacular languages. The audiences for these, for the mulberry paper manuscripts, was largely royal courts, people at funerals, and people at ritual celebrations. In palm leaf manuscripts, it matters which type. Sometimes they're for close study of people who study Pali, students of Pali. Other times they're just entertaining stories that anybody who visits a monastery can learn. So again, each manuscript is slightly different, and each genre is quite different in terms of use of language and the intended audience of them. So I'll leave it there.
예, 문선 선생님께서 해주신 질문에 대해서 정말 어렵습니다. 예, 정말 어렵습니다. 그래서 여행도 많이 해야 되고 내용도 사실은 찾기가 어렵습니다. 그리고 전부 다 모두 퍼즐 같다고 생각이 드는데요. 하지만 그렇기 때문에 오히려 학자들한테는 더 도전적이고 더 재밌는 주제가 연구가 아닌가라고 저는 생각을 합니다. 그리고 저는 이 연구를 굉장히 장기적으로 바라보고 있습니다. 한 번에 끝나는 연구가 아니라는 것이죠. 그래서 평생을 투자해서라도 하는 연구를 해야 된다고 생각하기 때문에 이제 그 작업이기 때문에 많은 사람의 도움을 받아가면서 연구를 하고 저 자신도 많은 사람을 도우려고 노력합니다. 그리고 신여은 선생님께서 질문하신 질문에 대해서는요. 일단은 하나의 필사본 안에 하나의 언어만 존재한다고 볼 수가 없습니다. 하나의 언어만 존재하는 것이 아니고, 그리고 또 한 가지는 팔리어가 안 쓰일 수는 없다는 얘기입니다. 그러니까 꼭 지방어나 토속어가 들어간다고 하더라도 팔리어가 대부분은 이제 그래도 20% 정도는 쓰인다고 하십니다. 그래서 그 이제 아까 말씀하신 질문은 굉장히 좋은 질문이었는데요. 이제 닭종이 같은 에 쓰인 필사본 같은 경우에는 이 닭종이 필사본들은 뭐 왕실에서 많이 쓰인다고 하네요. 즉 이제 좀 약간 이제 돈이 있으신 분들, 권력이 있으신 분들께 많이 쓰인다고 하네요. 그래서 뭐 장례식에서 쓰인다거나 아니면 이제 공식적인 의례 행사에서 쓰인다고 하고요. 뭐 그렇지만 그 닭종이 속에 이제 쓰인 필사본에도 이제 언어가 섞여 있지 않느냐? 다 섞여 있습니다. 뭐 예를 들어서 프라말라의 이야기 같은 경우에는 토속어로 쓰여져 있는데 아까 아비다르마라는 이제 명상을 하는 장면 같은 경우에는 그런 논장 같은 경우에는 팔리어로 쓰여 있다고 하고요. 그리고 팔리어가 쓰여 있는 부분이 있다면은 설명을 지방어로 한다고 합니다. 네, 어떻게
지금 선생님
예.
시간이 조금 없으신가 봐요. 지금
예.
딸을 학교에 데려다 줘야 되고 해서 그렇다고 지금 하나 마지막 지금 질문 하나 들어온 것만 마지막 받을 수가 있을까요?
예, 제가
선생님 좀 통역해 주시겠어요? Can you give just one question finally because you are on the time constraints to take your daughter to the school. Okay, yeah. Just final question, please. 강생님
Okay,
혹시
so
질문
yeah.
없으시죠?
Okay, so okay, yeah, okay, I'm going to translate the question. The question is from a student in Sohang University. What I heard about the Southeast Asians, especially in terms of the manuscripts and the religious studies, I heard that back in the days, like ancient era, that the reason why they use the tombstones or the stone inscriptions is that because they didn't have the paper at the time. So what you're talking about the manuscript and the materials, the ingredients to make the manuscripts, I have this feeling that, like, you know, maybe there must be, and you talked about like 3,000 years of tradition of making the palm leaves scripts, right? So up to what extent can we use this palm leaves or the mulberry paper manuscripts to study about ancient Southeast Asia?
Well, these manuscripts, even though the oldest ones in Thailand are, the oldest ones are not 600 years old. They were copies from older texts, so that we know that they were copied over time and handed down. And so we can trace that and use, again, stone inscriptions and metal inscriptions to confirm some of these things. And so they point to much older texts, even though we don't have the material remains of them. The mulberry paper manuscripts, we usually not more than 200, 250 years old at the oldest. But again, they're copies of older texts that we have evidence from stone inscriptions. So yeah, you can use it, and then of course paintings that are handed down as well, so you can see images that are much older than so yeah. I'm sorry, I have to go and take my daughter to school. She'll be late. But it is so lovely to be here, and thank you for your patience, and thank you for inviting me. And if you have any questions, please send them to my email, and I'm happy to answer any questions there. No problem at all.
Okay. 번역은 아까 말씀하신 내용은 이제 닭종이로 만든 그런 필사본 같은 경우에는 최고 250년까지 이제 그거를 추정하고 있다고 하네요. 그래서 고대 연구까지는 가기는 어렵다고 보고요. 고대 연구는 이제 그 비석이나 그런 이제 유적 등으로 보통은 많이 하고 있다고 합니다. 그래서 제가 지금 시장님 문제 이제 개인적인 사정으로 빨리 떠나야 돼서 여러분들께 너무 죄송하고요. 여기 이제 채팅창에 올려둔 이메일 주소로 연락을 주시면 제가 답을 해드리도록 하겠습니다.
네.
Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. Thank you so much for today's talk. It was very great for us to hear. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Have a good night.
Yeah.